In this video, we're going to talk about creating heroic male and female characters, or more specifically, the idealized concepts of men and women. The ideas and concepts that we're going to cover in this video are really going to help us in our development for our superheroes and superheroine characters, whether it's for comic books, science fiction, fantasy, whatever genre it is we are interested in. We'll cover a few basics in terms of shape and size difference, and we'll also talk about dynamics, balance, and execution also. So let's take a look at this now. So, what do we mean when we say idealized men and women? Well, when it comes to the science fiction, fantasy, or comic book genre, we are generally referring to a sense of heightened reality. Our goal as fantasy and comic book artists is to make things look and, more importantly, feel just a step beyond what we see in the real world. The landscapes, the architecture, the technology, and of course the anatomy. But these heightened ideals are not new. In fact, a lot of what we associate with masculine and feminine design ideals stretches back thousands of years, so we're not doing too much differently that hasn't been done before. What separates male and female design is not just the obvious anatomical differences, it's how we execute them. And with that execution, starting with the basics is always the best way to go, and the first basic is simply line. So, what does line have to do with any of this? Well, for these idealized figures, we want to approach our initial line work in a slightly different way for each. For our male heroes, we are looking for a far more angular approach to their line work compared to a more fluid line work for our ladies. So, why come at this with two different approaches? Well, structurally speaking, there are two reasons. First, it's just the general anatomical shape differences. The male physique gets significantly bulkier, which means a lot more shape and form starts to develop. The muscles also tend to stick out a lot more. The more shape and form that gets created, the more edges and corners we're going to have to draw. In contrast, the female form as it develops in athleticism retains a very curved physique. The shapes and forms that develop in even the more muscular women are generally still softer and more subdued, meaning less corners and more smoother gradations between forms, which also means less work for us to do. But there's also another reason for taking two different approaches, and that's skin thickness. Men have slightly thicker and rougher skin than women. If we were to compare it to material, it would be like the difference between leather and satin. And like those materials, how the skin behaves in relation to the underlying anatomy will result in slightly different outcomes. We can't necessarily indicate that thickness, but by using straighter line work for men and curvier line work for women, we are able to give, at least in some type of way, a visual representation to this difference in skin density. Going back to our material comparison, the folds in leather are going to look slightly different to the folds in satin. So there is a logic to doing this that goes beyond simply making our men look tough and strong and our women look sleek and sexy. In more elegant and practical terms, our male heroes are naturally more structured, our female heroes are more fluid, or in even simpler terms, corners for men and curves for women. If we are to give a definition to describe how we want our superhero physiques to look, we can say that our approach to men is rugged athleticism, and for our women, it's graceful athleticism. Now, this may have been a bit of a roundabout way of getting to this point, but it's important to understand why these ideas exist in the first place in order for us to create good habits for ourselves when we draw both. Our observations from life tell us that men and women's bodies are different, so it only makes sense for us to tackle them in slightly different ways. Now, it might seem obvious, but we are dealing with generalities here, and of course, there is going to be crossover with these two basic concepts. So, for instance, a more rotund male character will be more rounder, and a more CrossFit style female character will have more edges to her. But even in those extreme cases, we still want to keep these basic corners and curves concepts in the back of our mind. Let's evolve these ideas now and move into some more specifics, and in particular, some structural differences that we want to keep in the back of our mind. We're not going to do a deep dive into the obvious anatomical differences, most of that goes without saying, but we are going to look at some of the general shape and proportional differences that are going to help reinforce our heroic ideals. First, overall, the general differences in size between men and women is about 25 to 30%. The muscles on the man are more robust, they are fuller and bigger, and extend outwards a lot more. As was mentioned, women's muscles tend to be a lot more subtle and curved, and in most instances tend to look a lot more elongated. So, coupling this with our initial line work ideas, in simplified terms, heroic men bulge outwards and become boxier, our heroic ladies stretch out and become curvier. These ideas are most applicable in and around the torso area, where, of course, we have the most obvious differences between the sexes. Men, of course, have their wider shoulders, women, of course, have their wider hips and breasts. We can mix and match the shapes in some of the other areas a little bit more between the sexes, but if there's one area where we want to retain these bulging and curving ideals, the torso is definitely it. The rib cage, the pelvis, each help to create these relative shapes. The men's shoulders, they of course will get wider, and the oblique muscles in the abdominal area will start to straighten and push outwards. So everything is moving in a lateral direction for the guys. For the women, of course, we've got that classic hourglass shape, a narrower rib cage, along with those abdominal obliques that curve inwards as they make their way down to the pelvis. Even the most highly athletic female bodybuilders or CrossFit women will have this concaving shape present in their torso. So it's the most obvious area to differentiate the sexes. There's more work to do in the pelvis area that we'll cover shortly, but let's take a look at some of the other areas of difference first. Starting with the head, and women will be rounder and fuller, especially in and around the cheek area, whilst the brow line for the men will bulge out a lot more. In fact, the number of transitional planes along the forehead region for our men here is a lot more numerous, almost like taking a series of steps across the surface of the skull. So much so that sometimes a rather prominent bulge can appear right in the middle of the forehead. For our ladies, we are best ensuring that the plane changes here are far more gradual, or at the very least, fewer plane changes in total. If we over render our female heroes, especially in and around the eyes, we risk making her look far older than we intended. The male heroes don't suffer from this effect as much. In fact, in some cases, it can actually make them look a lot more rugged. This extends to things like facial expressions as well, especially the more intense ones like screaming, yelling, gritted teeth, etc. Too much line work and rendering, even in our male characters, can increase the look of the character's age. In terms of proportions, the head on both can be split into roughly equal thirds in height. With the neck, women's necks are about a quarter longer in this area, which then merges gracefully into the collarbone. For us guys, our necks kind of just stick in here, almost like the stem on a mushroom. In super athletic men, you'll also find that the neck can get quite wide, in fact, wider than the width of the head. So if we're drawing the Hulk or Thanos or any of those oversized male brute characters, that wider neck is definitely something that we want to incorporate. To the arms, more bulk in the men, more elongated in the ladies. Generally, more veins will also be more noticeable here for the guys. There will also be smaller muscles that start to pop out a lot more, so there's a lot more shape and form that gets created in the men. We do have to be careful, however, not to make him look too lumpy, otherwise we risk making him look like a snowman, so just be careful with that. To the wrist and hands, and a lot thinner in the wrists for our heroines. For our guys, the shape is very thick and robust, almost like a piece of wood. So think of a piece of 2x4 wood that you would get from a hardware store. It's quite thick here. That boxiness and thickness extends to the fingers and the palms. For our ladies, slightly smaller hands, but we can usually get away with slightly longer fingers. Generally, the length of the middle finger and the length of the palm are roughly the same measurement, but we can extend the finger's length for our ladies just a little bit here. In fact, fingers that are slightly longer tend to make our women's hands look just that little bit more elegant. Back to the torso, and more in particular the pelvis. As we already know, wider hips on the ladies, narrower hips for the men. If we move around to the side view, we see that there's a noticeable positional change. Women's pelvises tilt forward a lot more than men. This again results in significant shape difference. This gives off the illusion that there's more curvature in the female torso compared to her male counterpart. that her rib cage is tilting backwards a little bit more, and the shape of the breasts is also helping to play a part in that illusion too. For our heroes, everything looks a lot straighter and upright, again a lot boxier, a lot more rigid. Moving on to the backside, the glute shapes get a little lower for our ladies. This is where girls tend to store most of their body fat, so the shapes here are a lot more rounded and their position will drop down a little bit more. There's also a slight difference in directional tilt. Males will have very straight shapes in this area, almost like cinder blocks, and our ladies' glutes will turn outwards slightly, basically pushing out wider along with those hips. The upper thighs is kind of an area where we can see a lot of similarities. Thighs are the biggest, hardest working muscle in the body, so guys can get quite massive here, but girls can get quite thick and large here also. If you've seen some of those fitness models on Instagram, some of those girls get quite bulky and curvy in and around the glute and thigh area. So we've got a little bit more room to play with here, especially for those cool warrior women that we all like to draw. Much like the facial structures, we can do a little bit more work here in the quad area for the men, make those muscles look nice and big and have them really pop out. We just want to be a little bit careful not to overdo it in this area with our women's legs. When we increase the width of women's legs, they naturally start to look a lot stronger. We can still showcase those quads, but we just want to soften their appearance a little bit. For the calves, really just a slight size and proportional difference here. Where things can change is when our heroines are wearing footwear with heels. As her feet push upwards, the calves are going to become a lot more prominent, in some cases more prominent than the men. And finally, to the feet. Like hands, structurally identical between the sexes, thicker toes, sharper corners and edges for the men, rounder, curvier feet for the women, slightly longer and thinner toes. A lot of us tend to overlook feet as we draw our characters, but it's an important area that we have to focus on whether we want to or not. So get into the habit of practicing how to draw feet. If we're going to learn to draw, we want to do it correctly. So that's the main shape and proportional differences between the sexes. Let's now take a look at how dynamics and gravity play into our figures. Now, we really wouldn't think there would be much difference in terms of how gravity affects men and women, but it does play a part. You may have even seen some of those viral videos of men and women trying to sit in the same position, only for men to topple over. What this means then is that we're going to have slightly different dynamics for each sex, which is going to affect how we can pose them. But first things first, of course, gravity is always pulling us down, and sometimes it's a good idea to put a little reminder on our page just so that we keep this in the back of our mind. The center of gravity for women is in and around the belly button. For men, that center of gravity is in and around the sternum. That difference in center of gravity means both sexes have to position themselves in a slightly different way to achieve a similar pose. So if we look at this example here, we've got two very similar poses, but take note of how much closer to the chest the male's legs are. If he were to try and match the exact pose of our female model, he's going to come crashing to the ground. Our female model here, well, she can stand here quite comfortably and is in no real danger of toppling over in this position because her center of gravity is in and around her pelvis. In fact, she could probably bend over just a little bit more and still not be at any risk of crashing to the ground. So it's a small difference, but it also makes for a pretty big difference because this lower center of gravity allows our superheroines to be more flexible and dynamic. The girls are able to move and twist and turn their upper bodies whilst retaining a fairly narrow distance between their legs. Us guys, well, we've got to stretch our legs out a lot more to try to do a similar pose, and in some cases, the pose will still be too difficult for us to replicate. A noticeable example of this difference in real life is in gymnastics. There are different events for men and women in gymnastics, in part because of this slight variation in where gravity pulls us down. What this all means then is that our superheroines are going to be significantly easier to create dynamic gestural poses with. In all of our compositions, our main goal is to create very fluid and energetic compositions in order to draw the audience in and keep their attention for as long as possible. We only have one image to work with, unlike film, so we've got to make it count. Anything dynamic is fluid, anything fluid is curved, so our heroic ladies have the upper hand in this instance. Those curved shapes and lines we went over earlier means our warrior women naturally lend themselves to dynamic imagery. But what about our leading men? Well, we established that they are boxier and bulkier, and that's great for those standing poses. So, if we're drawing Batman standing upon the rooftops of Gotham City looking down, then that's a great structure for us to have. But it becomes a real problem when he starts to fight the Joker's minions. That boxiness starts to become a problem because those corners and edges start to stiffen up and straighten the dynamics of our pose. We're wanting nice, fluid action, but all these straight edges and lines here are interrupting that flow. It's almost like a visual stutter. So, what do we do to offset this? Well, we can do one of two things. We can obviously soften the edges up a little to become a little bit more curved. That will take away some of the ruggedness and toughness of our male physique. But if we pick and choose where we soften those edges, it shouldn't take away too much from the overall shape. The other option is to exaggerate the pose. Twist the torso a little further, stretch the arm out a little longer, bend that leg a little bit more. The more we push the male pose to the more extreme means the more we offset the stiffness that comes with his body shape. Now, it must be said though that even though there is a natural difference in gravity and dynamics between the sexes, at the end of the day, we are dealing with fantasy, and sometimes in order to get the best possible result, it's going to be better for us to break the rules than follow them exactly. So it's a classic case of knowing the rules first and then breaking them. So don't be afraid to push the dynamics of the heroes to a much more extreme degree. We are much better off making things look too dynamic than not dynamic enough. So now we've got a general idea for the concepts for our heroic figures. Let's take a look at this in a more advanced way. These are a couple of illustrations I did, which were done for a series of promotional images. So let's break down some of the choices that were made in these characters' execution. When we make a decision to illustrate and paint characters a certain way, we are essentially doing a sort of typecasting. In this instance, we are typecasting heroism. And what typecasting really is just a series of design components or a series of design choices. Now, we've already established one component for our heroic characters, and that's our initial line work. Cornered line for men, curved line for women. But there's more work that needs to be done here than just the outside contours. Taking a close look at our male hero here, again, very boxy outside contours, but it's not just the outside contours that have all these corners and edges. The interior form also has these ideas present. And what do we mean by form? Well, form is really just another design component. More specifically, form is about light and shadow shapes within the interior of our figure. Take note of how the changes in direction to the lighting are very sharp. Take note of how the shadow definition is very angular. The choices in shape for these interior forms are working alongside our outside edges to help amplify this sense of toughness and hardness within our male character. If we switch over to our female hero, what do we notice? Well, all of the light and shadow shapes are far more gradated, a far smoother transition across the interior that's helping to create our form. There are fewer hard divides between our light and shadow side. And what hard divides there are, like here in and around the chin, it's still a lot rounder in comparison. So these interior choices from our light and shadow shapes are helping to reinforce our initial line work approach to our heroes. We've got corners and edges along the outside and the inside for the men, and curves and gradations for the outside and inside for our women. All of these choices are relating to each other, which helps sell to the audience our heroic ideals. In fact, it helps to clarify these ideas to the audience without them even knowing. When design components like line and form relate to each other, we produce harmony. But there's still some choices here that go against our initial ideas. For our male, there's a lot more roundness in and around the calf area, and that's because the armor that he's wearing is supposed to look like blue chrome. Chrome is a very smooth surface, so it makes sense in this instance for this area to be a lot more rounded. Notice also that his relaxed arm is a lot rounder than the one that's holding the gun. More zigzaggy shapes within the gun arm, and zigzaggy shapes are a great way to create tension or action. So this is a man who's clearly ready to fight here. For our lovely lady here, take note of how her thighs are a lot straighter compared to the rest of her body. That slightly straighter area suddenly makes her legs look just that little bit stronger, just that little bit more powerful. Also take note of the shape of her head, slightly squarish features just to make her look that little bit stronger and heroic. So there's still room for some shape interpretations here for our heroes. Now, some may well say, well, why don't you just use straight lines for our women if you want to make her look strong like the men? Why only keep it in some areas? Well, taking aside the practical reasons mentioned earlier, strength comes in more than one form. Yes, straight lines and corners are great for strong foundations. We need it, of course, to make houses and buildings, for instance, but there's also strength in curvature that we generally don't consider. If we think organically, nature provides us with numerous examples of things that are curved, powerful, and strong. The trunk of a tree, the crashing waves from the ocean. The prime example I like to think about is a tornado. It's a massive moving cylinder that snakes its way across the surface that can destroy even the strongest of buildings. So we don't want to, and frankly shouldn't, attribute strength and power to simply boxes and corners alone. The value in curvature is that it's not just a useful visual marker to separate men from women in our designs, it's a representation that strength and power comes in more than one form. So have that concept in the back of your mind. So that's a full breakdown of the general ideas and structures we want to be thinking about when we draw our heroic characters. Now, if you're looking for a little bit more help in developing an understanding of figure drawing or light and shadow or even color theory, then you might want to check out my series of beginner-friendly art classes on Gumroad for purchase, or if you're on Skillshare, it's streaming there. So all of these classes are very beginner friendly, very easy for newcomers. So if you're interested in wanting to improve your comic or fantasy art, the links to the classes are in the description below.